The wind carried dust across the empty Main Street, rattling loose boards and whispering through the cracks of shuttered windows. The town had once known laughter, the sound of fiddle strings, and the clinking of glasses in the saloon. Now it seemed every soul who still walked its streets carried a shadow heavier than the one the sun cast. Among those shadows was a woman dressed in mourning black, her step slow, careful, as though every footfall might shatter the fragile life she had left. She was a widow, and in her eyes was the weary knowing of someone who had buried more than just a husband. She had buried hope, trust, and the belief that tomorrow would be any kinder than yesterday. From across the way, leaning against the rail of the hitching post, a cowboy watched her. His hat was pulled low, his jaw rough with days of dust and grit, and his hand rested easy against the neck of his horse. To the folks around, he was a quiet man, the kind who let silence do the talking. But in his silence, he carried a fire. For years he had seen her from afar, had watched her live a life she hadn't chosen but endured with grace. And though he never spoke it, his heart had settled its claim long before the world had taken her husband from her. She had never belonged to the man in the ground, not in his mind. No, she had always been his in the way that the stars belong to the night, his in the way a river belongs to the valley it carves. The widow walked past the mercantile, clutching her shawl close as the autumn wind pressed against her thin frame. She could feel the eyes of the cowboy on her, the weight of them pressing heavy, but she didn't look. She had grown used to stares, some full of pity, some of judgment, and some of something else she dared not name. Her late husband had been a hard man, harder than stone and twice as cold, and though no one spoke it outright, plenty in town knew she had never been truly loved in that marriage. Still, a ring had bound her, and respect for that bond had kept every whisper locked behind closed lips. But respect has its limits, and longing has a way of breaking through. The cowboy stepped away from his post, boots sinking into the dust with slow, deliberate weight. He followed her at a distance, not close enough for gossip, but not far enough to pretend chance alone had set him on the same path. His horse snorted and shook its head, sensing something in the air, something tense. She turned the corner toward the road that led out of town, her basket clutched in her hand. Maybe she felt it too, that low hum of change about to break loose, like the first rumble before a storm. He caught up with her by the edge of the corral, where the fences stood weather-worn and splintered. She stopped when she heard his steps, her spine stiff, but she didn't turn right away. When she finally did, her eyes lifted to meet his, clear and guarded, yet carrying the faintest flicker of something softer. He tipped his hat, his mouth set in a line that was both stern and strangely tender. "You're walking a long road alone," he said, his voice rough from years of dust and silence. "Too long." Her lips pressed thin, the basket trembling just slightly in her hands. "It's the only road I've got. It don't have to be," he answered. And there it was, the weight in his words that she had always felt but never allowed herself to acknowledge. He wasn't just talking about the walk home. He was talking about her life, her years ahead, and the choice she didn't know she still had. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, faster than it had in a long time. She opened her mouth to speak, to push back with the caution she'd lived by. But before the words could find shape, he stepped closer. His hand brushed the reins of his horse, grounding himself, as though the strength he needed came from the animal that had carried him through wild country. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping low, meant for her ears alone. "Get your things. You're mine now." The words weren't spoken like a command, nor like a plea. They carried something in between, a promise carved deep, the kind of vow that didn't ask for permission because it already belonged to the truth of who they were. Her breath caught, her knees weakened, and for a moment the world seemed to still. The canyon winds hushed, the horse stilled, and even the sky seemed to wait for her reply. But no reply came. Not yet. She stood caught between the weight of the past and the pull of something she had longed for but never dared to reach. His eyes held hers, steady, unyielding, yet not cruel. In them was a hunger, yes, but also a devotion carved by years of quiet watching, waiting, and holding back. She knew the cost of choice in a town like theirs. Every tongue would wag, every neighbor would judge, and every memory of her late husband would claw at her conscience. Yet here, in this moment, with the cowboy's words wrapping around her like the warmest blanket on the coldest night, she felt a spark stir inside her chest. The basket slipped from her hands, hitting the dirt with a dull thud, apples spilling and rolling into the dust. She gasped softly, more at the sound of her own heart breaking open than at the loss of her fruit. His hand moved as if to catch hers, but he stopped just short, waiting, letting her feel the space between them. That space was thin, fragile, alive with a tension that could snap either into ruin or salvation. She swallowed hard, her lips parting as though she might speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, bleeding gold and crimson across the rugged sky. The shadows stretched longer, and in those shadows lay the truth neither of them could outrun any longer. Her eyes flicked to the horizon, to the road that wound away into the canyons, the same road that had carried her into loneliness day after day. Then they returned to him, steady, searching, afraid yet unwilling to turn away. She had always known this moment would come, though she had told herself otherwise 1,000 times. It was here now, and the world felt like it was holding its breath with her. The cowboy took one step closer. She did not move back. And just as the silence grew too heavy to bear, a sound broke it, the distant crack of gunfire echoing through the valley. Her body stiffened, his jaw clenched, and both their eyes darted toward the canyon's edge. The spell shattered, replaced by the raw edge of danger. Somewhere out there, trouble had found its way near, and with it came the promise that their moment was far from safe, far from simple. The widow's breath came sharp, her hand instinctively reaching for the cowboy's arm. He felt it, that trust, small but real, and his eyes burned with a fiercer fire than before. Whatever choice she had to make, whatever future lay waiting, it would now be tested not by whispers in the street, but by bullets in the dust. The cowboy's words still hung between them, heavy as a vow, "Get your things. You're mine now." And with the echo of gunfire fading into the twilight, the widow knew the time for deciding had come faster than she ever expected. The echo of the gunfire lingered across the canyon, bouncing between red cliffs until it faded into a silence heavier than before. The widow's hand stayed on the cowboy's arm, her breath shallow, her eyes wide as though the sound alone had awakened ghosts long buried. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed on the horizon, sharp and watchful, the set of his jaw telling her he had heard such things too many times to be startled by them now. But what unsettled her more than the sound of the shot was the way he seemed ready for it, as though he had been expecting trouble to show its face sooner or later. The basket of apples lay forgotten at their feet, dust clinging to the red skins that rolled lazily across the ground. The horse shifted restlessly, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as though it too could sense danger close by. The cowboy laid a calming hand on its neck, steady as stone. His calmness unsettled her almost as much as the shot itself. A man did not stay this calm unless he had carried danger beside him for a long time. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. She wanted to ask him what he knew, what danger stalked them, but her lips stayed shut. There was no use pressing for answers when his silence said more than words could. He started forward, guiding his horse with one hand, and without fully deciding, she stepped beside him. It was safer to walk with him than to be left alone in the dust. The narrow path carried them along the edge of the town toward the wide open land where the road dipped into dry creek beds and wound toward the canyon mouth. As they walked, The widow could feel eyes watching them from the windows and porches they passed. Curtains shifted, rocking chairs stilled, and conversations died the moment their steps came into earshot. This was a town that thrived on whispers, and every whisper would now be about her, the cowboy, and the sound of a gun echoing in the distance. She lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning, though no one had spoken a word. She could almost hear the judgments forming in their minds. A widow walking beside a man like him, a man who carried shadows in his past. He was not the sort neighbors welcomed easily, but he was the kind who earned their fear and respect in equal measure. The widow's late husband had despised him, calling him a drifter, a trouble chaser, a man who lived by the law of his own making. Yet here she was, clinging to his presence as though it were the only rope keeping her from being swept away. When they reached the edge of town, the cowboy slowed and glanced back once. His eyes scanned the rooftops, the hills beyond, the open road. He was reading the land the way other men might read a Bible, studying every line, every sign, searching for the truth hidden in plain sight. His silence made her stomach twist with questions. Who had fired that shot? Was it meant for someone else, or was it meant for him? Or worse, meant for her because of him? "You should tell me," she finally said, her voice soft, almost breaking. "What do you know?" His eyes flicked to hers, steady, unwavering, but he didn't answer right away. He shifted the reins in his hand, squinted toward the horizon, then finally spoke. "Your husband left more than a memory behind. He left debts. And debts in these parts get collected in lead as much as coin." The widow's breath caught, a sharp gasp that left her throat dry. She wanted to deny it, to defend her husband even in death, but she couldn't. Deep down she had known. The long nights he spent away, the coins he gambled, the temper that grew shorter with every loss. She had suspected something darker than money was tied up in it, but she had never been brave enough to ask. Now the truth rose like a vulture circling overhead, waiting for the moment to strike. The cowboy kept walking, his boots crunching on the hard ground. He owed men you don't want to know. Men who won't forget because a gravestone stands in their way. They'll come looking, and when they do, they'll come for what he left behind. Her hand shook as she clutched the edge of her shawl tighter. "And what is it they think he left?" He stopped then, turning fully to face her. His eyes were dark, not with anger, but with a truth too heavy to soften. "You." The word struck her harder than any bullet could have. Her knees went weak, her chest hollow. She wanted to believe he was wrong, that no man would see her as anything worth chasing, but she knew the world wasn't kind. A widow without family, without land of her own, with no protection, she was as much a prize as money in the eyes of men who traded in power and fear. She swallowed hard, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her break. The cowboy's voice softened then, though it carried no less weight. "That's why I said what I said. Not because I mean to claim you like some sack of grain, but because if I don't, someone else will. And they won't come whispering. They'll come with fists and guns." She turned away, staring out at the vast stretch of land beyond the canyon, endless and unforgiving. The truth of his words burned inside her chest. She had lived her life trying to stay invisible, to survive quietly, to bear her burdens without complaint. But survival alone was no longer enough. The world had shifted the moment that gunshot cracked across the valley. She was no longer safe in her widow's black. She was a mark, a claim, a piece on a board where men played games with lives. The cowboy moved closer, his presence steady, grounding her. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his nearness was enough to draw a shiver through her. He had always carried himself like a man outside the rules of others, but now she saw there was something else, an oath, silent and unspoken, written in the way he watched the horizon as though he had promised himself never to look away again. "Why me?" she asked, her voice cracking despite her fight to keep it steady. Why risk yourself for me? He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, filled only by the low huff of the horse and the faint whisper of the wind through the brush. Finally, he said, because I've wanted you longer than I can remember. Longer than I ever had a right to. And I'll be damned before I let another man take what I've carried in my heart all these years. The words settled over her like a heavy blanket, warming and frightening all at once. She wanted to protest, to push him away, to cling to the safety of solitude. But part of her, buried deep and aching from years of coldness, stirred awake at the sound of his vow. It was wrong, she told herself. Wrong to feel it. Wrong to want it. Yet her heart didn't care what was right. It cared that someone saw her, truly saw her, in a world where she had been nothing more than a shadow. Before she could answer, the horse stamped and whinnied, its head jerking toward the canyon mouth. The cowboy stiffened, his hand instinctively dropping to the grip of his revolver. The widow followed his gaze, her stomach twisting as she saw movement far off a cloud of dust rising, the faint outlines of riders cutting across the horizon. The gunshot had not been a warning. It had been a sign. They were coming. Her breath caught, fear crawling up her throat. She wanted to run, to hide, but where could she go? There was no place left untouched by the reach of the men her husband had owed. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and in that moment she knew he had already chosen. He would stand between her and whatever storm was riding toward them. Whether she wanted him to or not, whether the town approved or not, he had bound himself to her. The riders grew clearer against the burning sky, their shapes stretching longer as the sun sank lower. Dust swirled in their wake, a storm of men and horses charging closer with every heartbeat. The widow clutched her shawl tighter, her knuckles white, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might give her away. The cowboy stood firm, hand steady on his gun, his other hand brushing the horse's mane as though to calm them both. The widow whispered, her voice trembling, "What do we do?" The cowboy's eyes never left the riders. "We face what's coming, together." The word together struck deep in her chest, and though fear burned hot in her veins, something steadier flickered beneath it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. The storm was nearly upon them, shadows stretching like claws across the ground, and the air grew thick with the sound of pounding hooves. The widow drew a sharp breath, her heart trapped between terror and hope, and as the riders closed in, she knew her life was about to change forever. Whether for salvation or ruin, she could not yet tell. All she knew was that the moment to hide was gone, and the cowboy's vow still echoed in her ears, unyielding, unbreakable. Get your things. Your mind now, Dot, and with the riders nearly upon them, the promise of those words would soon be tested in blood and fire. The riders came on with a purpose, drawing shapes across the last of the daylight. Their coats snapped with the wind, faces shadowed under hats that hid names and mercy alike. The cowboy shifted slightly to give the widow cover, setting himself between her and the line of dust. He did not pull his gun yet. He stood measured, as if patience were a shield a man could wear when the world reached for his life. The widow kept one hand on his sleeve. The simple contact steadied her more than she would ever admit. They did not ride straight at them. The lead man raised a hand and the small group split, some drifting toward the canyon road, the others veering toward town. It felt like a noose thrown wide. The cowboy made a small sound in his throat, something that could have been a growl if he were any other sort of man. He read the move for what it was. They wanted to spook the town, pin the pair in the open, and make sure any help thought twice before offering a hand. The leader nudged his horse forward by a few paces and called out in a voice too easy to be honest. He said they were only there to talk. He said no one wanted trouble. He said he carried word from men who only wanted what was owed. The cowboy did not answer. The widow stared at the man and felt the words flit over her skin like cold wind. His horse sidled and tossed its head. As if the animal could taste the lie. Another shot broke the air, not closed this time but placed well enough to jolt nerves. It was a warning sent to porches, to a sheriff who did not like to pick sides, to neighbors who preferred curtains over courage. Doors closed up and down the street. The only sound left was the steady ring of the blacksmith's hammer drifting from far behind them. Stubborn as a heartbeat, the cowboy finally spoke, voice calm and low. He said the widow had no part in what her husband had done. He said any debt was between men long gone and men still living, and that he would stand for her if anyone thought to cross that line. The leader gave a lazy nod as if he agreed in spirit. Then he mentioned the little farmhouse out past the cottonwood stream. He said there was a trunk under the bed and a ledger in the trunk, and in that ledger were numbers and names and a claim to a stretch of land most folks thought was worthless scrub. The widow's fingers tightened on the cowboy's sleeve. The trunk was real. She had dusted under that bed 100 times and never thought to lift the lid. The leader's voice picked up a silk edge. He said the land was not worthless. There was water trapped below the hardpan and a way to bring it up, and water meant cattle, and cattle meant power. He said her husband had promised to share, then doubled it, then bet the whole thing at a table in the saloon. He said the men he spoke for lost patience when the table went cold and the man went colder. The writers waited for the words to settle like ashes after a burn. The widow felt the shame of it curl in her stomach, not because she had done wrong, but because a dead man's choices still reached for her. The cowboy looked at her once, brief and steady, then turned back to the leader. He said any man who wanted to read that ledger was welcome to try. He said it would not be today. The leader smiled in a way that never touched his eyes and tipped his hat. He split his riders again and moved off at a slow pace, as if a hunt was best served cool by night. The threat was not a bullet. It was a promise to return. When the dust settled, the cowboy led the widow to the livery to stable the horse in a corner stall. The boy who worked there kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he angled a gaze toward the door like a prayer. The cowboy thanked him with a nod, then guided the widow down the back lane where the smell of hay and leather gave way to the sour mix of the saloon. He stopped short of the entrance and waited. A thin man with a stiff jacket and clean boots stepped out to sweep the stoop. He was the owner, and he was a kind of judge in this town, measuring every soul by the weight of coins in their pocket. The saloon man glanced at the widow and then at the cowboy, and his sweeping took on a careful rhythm. He said the table had seen many wagers, some clean and some not. He said the debt collectors did not come on their own. They were steered. Someone in town had sent for them when word of the widow's empty purse reached the wrong ear. He did not say who. He did not have to. The town was full of people who profited when fear kept a woman quiet. The saloon man said one more thing. He said a stranger had been asking about the ledger before the husband died. A stranger who never touched a drink and never raised his voice and never spoke his own name. The cowboy walked the widow to the small room she rented behind the dressmaker's shop. It was neat as a pin and lonely as a night in winter. She sat on the narrow bed and stared at the floorboards. He crouched to feel along the edges, searching for secrets in the old wood. He found nothing but dust, but the axe steadied them both. He said they needed to reach the farmhouse before the riders did. He said the trunk and the ledger might be bait, or they might be the only map out of this snare. Before they could leave, a soft knock came at the back door. The widow stiffened. The cowboy moved to the side and cracked it just enough to see. A young girl stood there, hair in braids, eyes quick as field mice. She worked at the hotel kitchen and carried news from one end of town to the other in the space between, clean plates and dirty ones. She said the sheriff wanted a word but not at the office. She said he would be at the churchyard at sundown. She said the riders had sent a boy to fetch him, and the boy looked scared enough to faint. They cut through alleys and came up behind the whitewashed church where the graveyard sloped away under cottonwoods. The sheriff stood among the stones like a man who knew too many names by heart. He was not corrupt. He was tired. He said plain as day that he could not hold off hired guns without townsfolk behind him, and the townsfolk were not eager to line up against men who might be gone tomorrow and back the next week with twice the number. He said the law could turn a page and stamp a seal, but fear could turn a good man into a stone by morning. The sheriff told them something the riders had not said. The water scheme was real. A company out of the rail line had surveyed the land quiet as a whisper and planned to lay pipe from the basin to a new yard north of town. If someone controlled the basin, someone else would pay to use it. The ledger would be a key, not because it said the land was valuable, but because it tied the value to names that would want their share kept in the dark. If the widow had legal claim, she could force a hearing in the county seat. That hearing would drag names into the light. Men built on shadows did not forgive that kind of threat. They left the church, with the bell tolling a single slow note for the end of day. The cowboy brought the horse around, swung into the saddle, and reached his hand down to the widow. She took it and settled behind him, arms tight at his waist, feeling the steady grip of muscle and breath. He pushed the horse toward the open country, keeping to dry washes and stands of brush to avoid the open road. Night gathered in the folds of the land. Coyotes called to each other and the wind pulled at her shawl. They reached the cottonwood stream as the moon hauled itself over the ridge. The farmhouse stood like a memory against the dark, windows blank, door leaning on tired hinges. The cowboy dismounted and tied the reins to a low branch. He listened first, long and careful, then guided the widow inside. The air smelled of old wood and cold ashes. The bed was still there, quilt folded, trunk tucked beneath it just as the rider had said. The widow's heart beat hard as the cowboy slid the trunk out and felt along the iron latch. It was locked. He leaned his shoulder and the hinge gave with a soft crack. Inside lay a wool coat, a Bible with a cracked spine, a hand-carved box, and wrapped in brown paper, a ledger bound in stiff leather. The widow touched it with 2 fingers as if it might bite. The cowboy opened the book to the first page. Numbers marched neat across the paper, columns of figures, notes in the tight slant of her husband's hand. But there were other marks, too. Names written in a different ink. The ink had bled into the paper like a wound. Before they could read more, a floorboard creaked in the next room. The widow froze. The cowboy closed the ledger and slipped it under his coat. He moved to the doorway and waited, his breath steady, his hand near but not on his gun. A figure stepped into view, hands raised to show they were empty. It was the saloon owner. He said he had followed at a distance because he could not trust anyone else to warn them. He said the riders were circling, and someone from town had lit a signal fire on the ridge. The cowboy did not invite him closer. He asked how the saloon man knew about the ledger before anyone else did. The man smiled without pleasure. He said he ran a house where secrets were currency and paper was safer than memory. He said he had seen her husband counting pages more than once and had asked for his tab to be written in that same careful hand. He said the last time the man had played, he had left angry and had muttered about a partner who would rather cut than share. The saloon man believed the partner was not one of the riders at all. The partner was in the town council. The widow felt the floor tilt beneath her. A councilman could summon a sheriff to a meeting and ask him to stand down. A councilman could hire riders and then claim to be shocked when trouble came. A councilman could point to a widow and say the law was firm while arranging that the law never quite reached her doorstep. The cowboy watched the saloon owner with eyes that missed nothing. Then he said if the man was telling truth, he had chosen a side. The saloon owner nodded. He said a town without honor did not serve business for long. He said he liked to count his profit with both hands and to sleep with both eyes closed. They left the farmhouse by the back door, crossing fields that had gone to weeds and mounds. The cowboy led them along a cut in the land that hid them from the ridge until they reached the cottonwoods again. The saloon man whispered that he had a wagon hidden near the old quarry, loaded with sacks of grain that could pass for any merchant's haul. He said the ride to the county seat was 2 hard nights if they kept off the roads. He said the ledger needed the judge, not a gunfight. The cowboy paused and listened to the night. A faint clank of tack carried on the wind. The riders were not far. He weighed the choice in the quiet before danger. He could ride straight at the men and scatter them or die trying. He could run for the county seat and trust that law would outrun greed. Or he could split their little group to keep the ledger from falling in one sweep. None of it felt certain. All of it felt costly. They chose a narrow path between choices. The saloon owner would take the wagon and a copy of the first page written in the widow's hand to prove the ledger existed. He would drive slow through open country as bait, because the riders would follow a wagon before they would chase tracks in brush. The widow and the cowboy would cut across the sulfur flats and aim for the old mission on the far side of the ridge, where a priest still kept records and a lockbox with a county seal. They could leave the ledger there with a prayer and a receipt. The widow tore a page from the ledger and copied the numbers, with careful strokes while the men watched for shadows. Her hand shook once and then steadied. She wiped a tear that had slipped free and tucked the book back under the cowboy's coat. He looked at her and saw something new. Not just fear. A steady kind of resolve that grows in people who have been asked to survive longer than seems fair. He pressed his hand briefly over hers. No words. Only the weight and warmth that said more than a sentence could carry. They moved out. The saloon owner took the wagon path toward the quarry, humming an old tune as if he were the kind of man who only counted sacks. The cowboy and the widow slipped into a wash lined with scrub and pale rock. The night wrapped around them, a cloak both safe and treacherous. Owls called. Far behind, a shout rose and cut off, then another. The riders had found the farmhouse. They would find the broken trunk. They would find tracks leading in too many directions, and rage would start to do the thinking for them. Near midnight, a storm rolled in, not with rain but with wind and grit that scoured the teeth and made the eyes water. They pressed on, heads down. The cowboy set a pace that worked with the land rather than against it. They reached the edge of the sulfur flats as the moon slipped behind a thick band of cloud, turning the world into a smear of shadow and pale ground. The horse snorted and balked. The widow whispered to it and stroked its neck. It knew her voice now. At the first pale hint of dawn, they reached the low wall of the old mission. The bell tower rose like a finger pointing heavenward. The door stood shut with a heavy bar across it. The cowboy gave a quiet knock and waited. After a long moment, a light showed behind a high window, and the bar lifted with a grinding sigh. An old priest peered out, chin bristled, eyes sharp despite the hour. He knew the cowboy. He knew the widow. He looked at the ledger hidden under the coat and stepped aside to let them in. They set the book on a wooden table that still bore scars from meals and prayers given long before. The priest listened as the cowboy laid out the bare facts. He asked no questions that wasted time. He opened a strong iron box and showed a seal that marked it as county property held in trust. He said he would place the ledger inside if the widow signed a statement of custody. He warned that once sealed, the book would draw men like wolves to a fresh trail. He asked if they were strong enough to stand the chase that would follow. The widow dipped the pen and signed, with a hand steadier than it had been the night before. The priest placed the ledger into the box and turned the key. The sound of the lock closing rang in the quiet room. The cowboy exhaled once, slow and controlled, as if he had been holding the breath for a full day. It was a small victory. It did not feel safe. It felt like a door closing behind them while another door opened in front. Before they could step back out into the cool morning, the bell in the tower shook once on its own weight, a dull clang that was not made by any hand inside the mission. The priest looked up sharply. The cowboy moved to the window and peered through a slit in the wall. He saw movement at the edge of the flats. He counted riders. More than before. And there, driving a wagon with a whip in the air, was a figure standing to urge the team faster. The saloon owner had company behind him. Too much company. The cowboy turned to the widow. He said they would have to hold them long enough to let the priest ride for the judge with proof of custody. He said what was coming would take more than a gun and more than a prayer. The widow squared her shoulders. She said she would stand beside him. The priest set a hand on their heads, not a blessing, more like a brace. The bell sounded again louder. The riders had seen the tower. The flats carried their voices like a drum. The cowboy stepped to the door and lifted the bar. He did not pull his weapon yet. He set his hat on his head and glanced back once at the widow. The look said she was no claim. She was a choice. It said the fight ahead had meaning. Then he pushed the door open to the morning and the trouble it carried, and the first echo of hoofbeats rolled over the stones like thunder waiting to pick a side. The air outside the mission carried the smell of dust and sweat, and it was heavy with the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. The riders were spreading across the flats, their silhouettes dark against the pale rise of the morning. The cowboy stood in the doorway, his shoulders square, his hand close to his weapon, though not yet on it. He waited, because waiting sometimes told a man more than any bullet. The widow stepped to his side, her chin lifted though her stomach nodded. She could feel the ground trembling faintly with the weight of hooves. Every step of the riders drew them closer to whatever end this day was going to bring. The priest moved behind them, slipping papers into his satchel, sealing the statement she had signed with wax. His face was lined but steady. He said he would ride at the first break they gave him, whether it was bought with words or fire. He did not try to sound brave. He only sounded sure, like someone who had carried burdens heavier than fear. The widow touched the table once more where the ledger had been, as if the wood still carried the weight of it, then turned back to the open door. The riders halted 100 yards out. The leader from before was there, but he had more men now. Twice as many, maybe more. Dust hung behind them like a curtain hiding what else might be coming. His voice carried sharp and clear when he called out. He said they had no quarrel with holy walls, but they would burn them if it meant what they wanted was turned over. He said the ledger was the key to a deal worth more than gold, and that no widow and no stranger had the right to keep it locked away. His horse tossed its head, and the sunlight caught the flash of steel at his belt. The cowboy answered him plain. He said the ledger was sealed in trust and that the law would decide the claim. He said any man who tried to break that trust would find himself answering not only to him, but to a judge in the county seat. The leader laughed, not because he found it funny, but because he wanted his men to hear him sound fearless. He said no judge in the county would care. Not when a rail company had already chosen who would drink water and who would beg for it. He said the widow could walk free if she handed over the book, but the cowboy would not see another sunrise. The widow felt her throat close at the words, but she saw the cowboy's jaw tighten, not in fear but in a kind of grim acceptance. He had expected this. He had carried it in the way he had stood from the moment the riders first appeared. He looked at her for the smallest moment, and she saw what he meant. He was not standing here for himself. He was standing for her, for what the land might be, for something cleaner than deals made in shadows. She swallowed hard and forced her voice to carry. She said the ledger was already gone, locked where no hand here could reach it. She said if they wanted to find it, they would have to follow the priest into the county seat. Her words carried more strength than she felt, but they rang out against the flats all the same. The men muttered, some shifting in their saddles. A few spat into the dirt, uneasy. Not all of them wanted to ride against a mission and a priest. Not all of them wanted to test a stranger who carried himself like he had been through worse. But the leader raised his hand and their muttering fell. His eyes burned steady on the cowboy. He said if the book was gone, then blood was the only thing left to bargain with. He said they would take the widow to force the priest's hand when he returned. The cowboy moved then, stepping out from the doorway into the open morning. His boots sank slightly in the dust, his coat brushing at his knees. He told the widow to stay inside, but she followed him 2 steps before stopping. He did not look back. He stood alone in the wide space, the riders spread before him like a tide ready to break. The sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the flats. Time slowed. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. The leader's hand twitched near his gun, but he did not draw. He wanted the cowboy to make the first move, to mark himself as outlaw instead of defender. The cowboy stayed still. His patience gnawed at the riders, worked into their nerves. One of them cursed and kicked his horse forward a few steps, then checked when the cowboy's eyes met his. The silence stretched taut, ready to snap out behind the riders. A small wagon rattled into sight, the saloon owner standing tall in the traces. His grain sacks bounced as the wheels hit ruts. He cracked the whip and shouted like he was nothing more than a merchant running late to town. But the riders turned their heads, saw him, and the spell of stillness broke. The leader barked an order. Half the men wheeled their horses and tore off toward the wagon, dust rising behind them. The cowboy's hand dropped to his weapon in that same instant. Steel sang in the open air as guns cleared leather. The flats exploded in shouts and gunfire, the sound rolling against the mission walls like thunder given voice. The cowboy fired once, twice, each shot measured and sharp. A horse screamed and reared, a rider fell. The widow ducked behind the doorway, heart hammering, but she could not drag her eyes from the man out there alone against the tide. Smoke hung in the air already, acrid and thick. The leader stayed back, letting his men rush forward first. He wanted the cowboy worn thin before he took his own shot. The widow saw it in his stance, the way he sat straight and calm, a viper waiting to strike only when the prey had bled enough. Her fingers dug into the wood of the doorframe. She wanted to scream at the priest to run, but the priest was already slipping through the side gate, his satchel tight against his chest, his small mule carrying him into the gullies where dust could hide a man. The riders pressed harder. Bullets tore splinters from the mission wall, struck sparks from stone. The cowboy moved with the ground, never wasting a step, each motion fluid as if he had rehearsed this battle in his mind 100 times. He dropped to one knee, fired, rose again. One rider broke through close, swinging down with a rope, but the cowboy's shoulder slammed into him, sent him sprawling before the noose could slip. The widow cried out without meaning to, her voice lost in the roar of hooves. More riders circled, cutting wider arcs, trying to pen him in. The wagon was fleeing fast across the flats, chased by the others, gunfire popping like corn in a skillet. The saloon owner lashed the team harder, leaning low, grain sacks spilling in his wake like bait. The cowboy spared it one glance, then turned back to the fight at hand. He could not think of both battles. He had to hold the ground here, no matter what it cost. The widow stepped out at last, unable to remain in the shadows. She clutched her husband's old rifle, the one that had hung over the bed in the farmhouse. Her hand shook, but she braced it against the doorway, aimed at the open space between 2 riders. She fired. The kick slammed her shoulder and the shot went wide, but it startled them enough to pull back for a heartbeat. The cowboy glanced her way, and though his face was set, his eyes carried something like pride. The leader finally drew his weapon. The sound of it clearing leather cut through the chaos like a blade. He leveled it at the cowboy, calm and slow. The widow saw it, but her voice stuck in her throat. The cowboy turned just as the leader squeezed. The shot cracked, echoing across the flats. Dust plumed near the cowboy's boots, close enough to sting. The leader smiled, adjusting his aim for the next. The widow raised the rifle again, her shoulder aching, her vision swimming, but she forced her breath steady. The cowboy knew the shot was coming. He lunged forward, closing the space, his own gun rising. Time thinned to a thread, stretched tight between trigger and heartbeat, between life and the weight of all that had led here. The riders roared. The horses screamed. The priest vanished into the gullies, and the wagon thundered across the flats with half a dozen men in pursuit. The leader's finger curled again. The cowboy's arm swung. The widow's breath caught in her chest. The whole world seemed to hold itself still for the smallest moment, teetering at the edge of what would come next. The leader's gun fired again, a sound sharp enough to crack the morning in two. At the same moment, the cowboy's shout rang out, echoing hard against the stone of the mission wall. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air trembled with smoke and the raw weight of violence. Then the leader slumped sideways in his saddle, his pistol falling from his hand as he toppled into the dust. His horse bolted away with a startled scream, leaving him sprawled still on the ground. The riders who had charged forward pulled up short, their eyes darting from their fallen leader to the cowboy who stood unmoved, his weapon steady, his chest heaving but his gaze cold. The widow lowered the rifle, her breath ragged, her shoulder burning from the recoil. The riders muttered among themselves, unease spreading through their ranks like fire and dry brush. Without their leader's steady hand, their anger thinned into doubt. A few began backing their horses away, the thunder of hooves now fading instead of rising. The cowboy did not chase them. He let silence and stillness do the work. He knew fear would ride faster than his bullets ever could. The saloon owner's wagon rattled back into sight on the far side of the flats, still chased but now gaining distance as the riders lost heart. The priest was long gone into the gullies, the satchel safe against his chest. The ledger that had caused so much bloodshed was now bound for the county seat, where signatures and seals would weigh heavier than threats. One by one, the riders turned, some galloping away into the hills, others hanging back a moment longer before spurring their horses after the rest. Soon, only dust lingered, swirling in the morning light. The cowboy lowered his weapon at last. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time the widow saw just how much weight he carried in his frame. He had stood against them all, and now that the moment was gone, the toll showed. She hurried to him, her boots sinking in the churned dirt. Her hands touched his arm, steadying him though he did not stumble. His eyes softened when they met hers, though his face was marked by weariness. "You're still here," she whispered. Though her voice cracked, he gave a slow nod, then looked back to the fallen man. The leader's shadow lay still in the dust, a reminder of the cost of greed and violence. The widow turned her face away. She had seen enough death in her life, enough to know it never truly left a person. She gripped the cowboy's hand instead, grounding herself in the truth that he was alive, that the mission still stood, that the worst had passed. The saloon owner rode in on his wagon, shouting and waving, grain sacks spilled behind him like a crooked trail. He jumped down, his boots thudding heavy. He looked at the widow and the cowboy, then at the leader's body, and let out a long breath. "Well," he muttered, "that's one way to end the morning." His words carried no humor, only relief wrapped in weariness. They gathered what they could. The widow helped drag the fallen aside, her heart heavy but her hands steady. The cowboy spoke little, his silence saying more than words. Together they returned inside the mission. The priest's belongings remained scattered where he had left them, proof that his flight had been real and quick. He would ride fast, and by evening he would be beyond the reach of these men. By nightfall, the flats were empty again. The widow and the cowboy sat by the fire in the missions hall, the saloon owner nearby nursing a bruised shoulder from his wild ride. The silence now was different than the tense stillness of the morning. It was heavy but clean, the kind that comes after the storm has broken and moved on. The widow finally let herself rest, her head leaning back against the stone wall. The days that followed brought slow change. The riders did not return. Word spread through the town of what had happened at the mission, and with it came both fear and a strange kind of pride. Folks whispered about the widow who had stood her ground and the cowboy who had held back a tide with nothing but grit. The saloon owner told the story louder than anyone, adding color with every retelling, though his eyes always softened when he looked at the widow. He knew the truth was harsher than his tales, that it had not been glory but survival that carried them through. When the priest returned weeks later with papers sealed by the county, the ledger now sworn into law, the widow felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. Her husband's debts, his dark dealings, and the shadow of what he had left behind were no longer chains dragging her down. The land would be hers, clear and rightful, not because of trickery or violence, but because the truth had been carried through fire and proven. She could stand on her soil without shame, knowing it had been one honest. The cowboy stayed near through it all. He did not push, did not ask for more than she was ready to give. He fixed fences, mended saddles, kept watch when riders passed along the far road. He was there, a steady presence, not claiming what was hers but guarding it as though it were his own duty. She came to see that he had not stood against the riders for the ledger alone. He had stood for her, for what he had always carried quietly in his heart. In the evenings, as the sun slid low and painted the horizon with fire, the widow would sit on the porch and the cowboy would settle nearby. Sometimes they spoke of small things, sometimes of nothing at all. Yet in the quiet, she felt safe. She felt the ache of grief easing, not gone but no longer sharp enough to cut her open each time it stirred. She learned to laugh again, though soft at first, and each time she did, the cowboy's eyes warmed. The town slowly began to trust again, though scars remained. The saloon filled each night with talk of the mission standoff, the story retold so often it began to sound like legend. But for the widow and the cowboy, it was no legend. It was the mark of a morning when everything had nearly been lost and then remade. The ledger, the land, the law, all of it mattered. But what stayed with them most was the way they had stood together when fear would have been easier. Seasons shifted. The fields greened again, the creek ran clear, and the sound of children laughing carried farther across the town streets. The widow planted new rows, the cowboy helping with the heavy work, his sleeves rolled and his back bent to the soil beside hers. There was peace now, not perfect but steady. And in that peace, she found space to breathe, to hope, to dream of something more than survival. One evening, as the light faded and the crickets began their chorus, she turned to the cowboy. Her voice was quiet but sure when she said, "You stayed when you could have gone." He met her gaze, his eyes steady, and answered simply, "I wasn't going anywhere." That truth sank deep, warming her in a way no fire could. The land was safe, the ledger sealed, the threats scattered. The widow had her freedom, and she had a future no longer chained to the mistakes of the past. The cowboy had his vow fulfilled, not to a ledger or a piece of land, but to the woman he had always wanted to protect. Together, they had carried the weight of fear and found strength in one another, and as the night wrapped around them, the widow felt the first true peace she had known in years. The dangers had passed, the conflicts resolved, and the lessons of it all etched clear. Strength was not in land or paper or weapons. Strength was in standing firm when fear pressed close, in trusting those who walked beside you, and in holding to hope even when the sky seemed darkest. The story of the widow and the cowboy settled into the town's memory, passed in whispers and songs, remembered not for violence, but for the courage that rose when it mattered most. And for the widow herself, It was not legend but life, the beginning of something new born out of fire, forged with trust and bound with quiet love.